The furnace stood 40 feet tall, built from iron plate and firebrick, its cylindrical throat rising above the steelworks floor like a monument to controlled combustion. For 18 months, it had burned without pause, fed continuously with coke and limestone and ore, producing molten iron in quantities that justified its enormous appetite for fuel and air. The blast had been steady, the output reliable. The heat so constant that men working nearby had learned to navigate by its radiance alone, feeling their way through darkness by the warmth against their faces. Then, on a Tuesday in October, the decision was made to shut it down. The procedure was routine. The charging mechanism was halted. The fuel supply was cut. The blast from the external blowers was reduced in stages, carefully managed to prevent backflow or sudden temperature collapse. Over the course of 6 hours, the furnace cooled from white heat to dull red, then to black. The roar diminished. The vibration ceased. By evening, the structure stood silent, its iron shell warm to the touch, but no longer radiating the fierce energy that had defined its presence on the factory floor. Maintenance was scheduled for the following morning. Minor repairs to the charging platform. Inspection of the throat lining. Replacement of worn brick in the upper stack. Work that required men to approach closely, to lean over the mouth of the furnace, to reach into spaces that had been inaccessible during operation. The foreman examined the exterior with his hand, feeling for residual heat. He found warmth, but nothing dangerous. The blast had been stopped. The fire extinguished. The air supply adjusted to prevent any sustained combustion. He signed the clearance form without hesitation. By every standard known to the men who operated these machines, the furnace was safe. It had been shut down according to procedure. It had cooled below the threshold of ignition. It stood inert, a hollow iron tower waiting for inspection and repair. The workers assigned to the morning shift arrived with tools and scaffolding, moving with the confidence of men who had performed similar tasks dozens of times before. They knew the risks of molten metal and open flame. They understood the dangers of heat and pressure, but those dangers had been eliminated. The furnace was cold. The fire was out. There was nothing left to fear. The platform stood 8 feet above the factory floor, a wooden structure braced against the furnace throat, built to allow access to the charging mechanism and the upper regions of the stack. 4 men climbed onto it just after dawn, carrying hammers and pry bars and buckets of mortar. The air was still. The factory around them was beginning its daily cycle, but here, near the dormant furnace, there was an odd quiet, a sense of absence where constant noise had been. Thomas Whitley was the first to feel it. He was leaning forward, examining the brick at the furnace mouth when the dizziness came. Not sudden, not sharp. A gradual softening of focus, a sense that the platform beneath him was tilting when he knew it was not. He straightened, blinking, and the sensation eased. He attributed it to fatigue. He had worked late the previous night on a different furnace, and sleep had been brief. He returned to his inspection, leaning closer to the brickwork. The dizziness returned, stronger now. His vision narrowed. The edges of the furnace mouth seemed to pulse with a light that wasn't there. He stepped back again, breathing deeply, trying to clear his head. Beside him, another worker, Michael Carrick, was rubbing his temple, his face drawn. "You feel that?" Carrick asked. Whitley nodded. "Lightheaded." "Same." They stood together on the platform, both men unsure whether to continue or retreat. The furnace gave no indication of danger. No heat radiated from its mouth. No smoke rose from its depths. The air around them was cool and still, but something was wrong. Whitley could feel it in his chest now, a tightness that had nothing to do with exertion. His breathing felt shallow, insufficient, as though the air itself had thinned. Below them, on the factory floor, a third worker named Samuel Driscoll was arranging scaffolding components. He paused, straightened, and then sat down abruptly on a wooden crate. His face was pale. His hands were trembling. He looked up at the men on the platform and tried to speak, but the words came slowly, slurred at the edges. "Hold." He slumped forward. Whitley shouted down to him, but Driscoll didn't respond. Carrick started toward the ladder, then stopped, gripping the railing. His legs weren't cooperating. The dizziness had become disorienting, a spinning sensation that made movement dangerous. Whitley reached for him, steadying him against the platform edge. "Get down," Whitley said. "Both of us, now." It descended carefully, each step requiring concentration. By the time they reached the factory floor, Driscoll was lying on his side, breathing but unresponsive. Another worker ran toward them, shouting for help. The foreman appeared from across the floor, moving quickly, his face tight with concern. "What happened?" he demanded. "Don't know," Whitley said. His own voice sounded distant to him, muffled. "Just came over us." The foreman knelt beside Driscoll, checking his pulse, his breathing. "Get him outside." Fresh air. Men lifted Driscoll and carried him toward the factory doors. Whitley and Carrick followed, moving slowly, their legs unsteady. Behind them, the furnace stood silent and cold, offering no explanation. The factory doors opened onto a cobblestone yard where morning light cut sharp angles across stacked iron and crates of raw material. Driscoll was laid on the ground near a water trough, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Whitley and Carrick sat against a wall, heads between their knees, gulping air that felt suddenly rich and clean. The dizziness began to fade. Vision cleared. Strength returned to their limbs. Inside, other men who had been working near the furnace were beginning to show symptoms. A bricklayer named Joseph Kemp staggered away from the platform, his hand pressed against his forehead. He made it 15 feet before sitting down heavily on the factory floor, unable to continue. A laborer bringing mortar to the worksite dropped his bucket and leaned against a support column, his breathing rapid and irregular. The foreman, still inside, saw the pattern forming and shouted for everyone to evacuate the area. Back away from the furnace. Everyone out. Men moved quickly, some supporting others who could barely walk. They retreated toward the far end of the factory floor, then outside into the yard where Driscoll was beginning to regain consciousness. He sat up slowly, his face confused, his memory of the collapse incomplete. He remembered feeling tired. He remembered sitting down. Everything after that was absent. The foreman stood in the doorway, looking back toward the furnace. From this distance, it appeared completely benign. A dark iron cylinder rising into the factory shadows. No smoke, no flame, no visible discharge. The platform stood empty, tools abandoned where they had been dropped. The air around the structure looked no different than the air anywhere else in the building, but something was coming from it, something invisible. Something that spread outward from the furnace mouth without color or smell or sound. He turned to Whitley. "Did you see anything? Smoke? Steam?" "Nothing," Whitley said. "Just felt wrong, got dizzy, couldn't breathe right. Any smell?" "None," the foreman frowned. He had seen men overcome by heat exhaustion, by smoke inhalation, by fumes from chemical processes. This fit none of those patterns. The men recovered quickly in fresh air. Their symptoms had appeared without warning. And the furnace itself showed no signs of active combustion or leakage. He walked back inside, stopping 50 feet from the furnace. He stood there for a full minute, watching, waiting for some indication of what had happened. The air felt normal. His breathing was clear. He took another step forward, then another. Nothing changed. He advanced to within 30 feet of the structure and stopped again. The dizziness came gently, almost imperceptibly at first. A slight sense of imbalance. A faint ringing in his ears. He held his position, testing the sensation, trying to determine if it would intensify. It did. Slowly but unmistakably, the same symptoms the workers had described began to manifest. He backed away immediately, returning to the doorway where the air felt different, cleaner, more substantial. Whatever was happening, it had a boundary, a zone of influence that extended outward from the furnace in a pattern he couldn't yet define. The danger was real. It was present. But it remained invisible. The factory superintendent arrived within the hour, summoned by a runner sent from the floor. He was a man named Howard Brennan, 40 years in steelworks, experienced with furnaces of every design and temperament. He listened to the foreman's account with growing concern, then walked inside to see the dormant furnace for himself. He approached cautiously, stopping at the same distance where the foreman had felt symptoms. He stood there, breathing slowly, assessing. Within moments he felt it too, the dizziness, the shallow breathing, the sense that something essential was missing from the air. He retreated and stood in the doorway, thinking. "Check for fire," he said. "Anywhere in the structure. Pockets of combustion in the lower chambers, in the slag passages, anywhere." Men with long iron rods probed the furnace openings, searching for heat or flame. They found none. The interior was dark and cool. The slag taps showed no residual glow. The ash pits were cold. Every accessible region of the furnace had been examined, and nothing indicated active combustion. "Chemical leak," Brennan said. "Something stored nearby. Chlorine, sulfur compounds, anything that could create fumes." The factory floor was searched. Barrels were inspected. Storage areas were checked. No chemicals were found near the furnace. The only materials present were iron, coke, limestone, and brick, none of them capable of producing the observed effects. Brennan walked the perimeter of the danger zone, trying to map its extent. It seemed to radiate from the furnace mouth in a rough circle, strongest near the platform, diminishing with distance. But the boundary wasn't sharp. Men could approach to a certain point before symptoms began. Past that threshold, the air became hostile, though it showed no visible difference. He returned to the yard where the workers were gathered. Driscoll was sitting upright now, drinking water, his color improving. Whitley and Carrick were standing, talking quietly, comparing what they had felt. Kemp sat alone, still pale, his breathing not yet fully restored. "Anyone smell anything unusual?" Brennan asked. Heads shook. No one had detected any odor. Smoke, even faint. No smoke, no haze, no visual indication of any kind. Brennan turned back toward the factory entrance, staring at the furnace visible in the dim interior. He had seen men killed by gas leaks, by smoke inhalation, by suffocation in confined spaces. But those incidents always involved detectable sources: ruptured pipes, burning materials, enclosed chambers where air had been displaced. This was different. The furnace had been shut down, the fire extinguished, the air supply cut. By every principle he understood, there should be nothing dangerous about the structure. And yet men had collapsed near it. Others had felt symptoms severe enough to drive them away. The evidence was undeniable. Something was present, something invisible and odorless and capable of incapacitating workers within moments of exposure. He needed time to think. He needed to consult with engineers who understood furnace mechanics more deeply than he did. He needed answers that didn't exist in his immediate experience. "No one goes near that furnace," he ordered. "Rope it off, post a guard. I want it isolated until we know what we're dealing with." By afternoon, ropes had been strung around the furnace in a wide perimeter, and a man was stationed at each approach to prevent anyone from entering the danger zone. Brennan stood near the boundary with another engineer named Martin Ashford, who had been brought in from a neighboring facility to offer a second opinion. Together, they watched the furnace, discussing possibilities, testing theories against what had been observed. "If it's not fire and not a chemical leak," Ashford said, "then it's something already present, something produced when the furnace was operating, still there after shutdown." "Residual combustion gases," Brennan said. "Possibly, but where? The blast was stopped. The flue draws upward. Any gases should have vented through the stack." They walked closer to the boundary, both men alert for symptoms. Brennan carried a safety lamp, the kind used in mines to detect dangerous atmospheres. He held it forward, watching the flame. At a distance of 40 feet from the furnace mouth, the flame burned normally. At 30 feet, it began to flicker. At 20 feet, it dimmed noticeably, the flame smaller and less vigorous than it should have been. "Air's wrong," Brennan said. "Not enough oxygen." Ashford nodded. "Something's displacing it." They retreated and examined the lamp in clear air. The flame returned to full strength immediately. Brennan lowered the lamp to ground level. The flame remained strong. He raised it overhead, still strong. The displacement wasn't uniform. It was concentrated at a specific height, roughly the level where men stood and breathed. "Stratification," Ashford said. "Gas heavier than air, settling into a layer." "From where?" "Inside the furnace. Trapped in the lower chambers, the Bosch, the hearth. Cooling after shutdown, becoming denser, sinking to the bottom. Then leaking out slowly through the tires, the tap holes, any opening at ground level." Brennan considered this. The furnace had multiple openings at its base. The tires where blast air entered during operation. The tap hole where molten iron was drawn off. the cinder notch for slag removal, all of them connected to the interior cavity. If gases had been trapped inside during shutdown, those openings would provide paths for slow release as pressures equalized. Carbon monoxide, Brennan said. Most likely, colorless, odorless, heavier than air when cool, poisonous in low concentrations. They both knew the gas. It was a byproduct of incomplete combustion, always present in furnace atmospheres, normally vented safely through the stack during operation. But after shutdown, with the blast stopped and the draft collapsing, the gases would have nowhere to go. They would cool, become denser, sink to the lowest points in the furnace structure. How long before it clears? Brennan asked. Depends on the volume trapped and the rate of leakage. Hours, maybe longer. Brennan walked to the factory wall and sat on a crate, thinking through the mechanics. The furnace had been operating at high temperature and pressure for months. The combustion zone had been filled with carbon monoxide, hydrogen, nitrogen, and other gases produced by the reduction of iron ore. When the blast was stopped, those gases would have remained inside, trapped by the cooling metal and diminishing draft. As the temperature dropped, they would contract and settle, filling the lower chambers with a concentrated atmosphere that had nowhere to escape, except through small openings at the base. The workers had approached in the morning, hours after shutdown, believing the furnace safe. But the gases had still been there, leaking slowly into the surrounding air, pooling at breathing height, invisible and undetectable. Night fell over the steelworks, and Brennan ordered lamps placed around the roped perimeter, creating a ring of light that marked the danger zone. He remained on site, unwilling to leave until the hazard had been fully understood and contained. Ashford stayed with him, and together they discussed the internal geometry of the furnace, trying to estimate how much gas might still be trapped inside. The hearth alone holds several hundred cubic feet, Ashford said. The Bosch and stack add more. If the entire cavity was filled with combustion gases at shutdown, we're talking about thousands of cubic feet. All of it contaminated. Most of it. Carbon monoxide percentage depends on how efficiently the furnace was burning before shutdown. Could be 10%, could be 30%. Brennan did the calculation in his head. Even at 10% concentration, the volume of carbon monoxide was staggering, and it was denser than air when cooled, which meant it would resist natural ventilation. It would cling to the floor, spread outward slowly, persist for hours. We need to force it out, he said. Open all the lower passages, let it drain away. Dangerous, Ashford warned. Whoever opens those passages will be exposed. Not if we do it carefully. Long rods, work from outside the boundary. Open the taps and cinder notch, let the gas flow out and dissipate. They organized a crew willing to attempt the task. Men approached the furnace from upwind, using iron bars to pry open the tap hole plug and the cinder notch cover. The plugs resisted, sealed by residue and corrosion, but eventually gave way. As the openings enlarged, air rushed out, invisible but clearly present. The men retreated immediately, and Brennan watched from a safe distance, waiting to see if the release would alter the danger zone. Over the next hour, the perimeter seemed to shrink. The safety lamp could be carried closer to the furnace without the flame diminishing. The air at ground level felt less oppressive. Men who had been monitoring their own symptoms reported feeling normal at distances where they had previously felt dizzy. The trapped gases were escaping, slowly but measurably. The furnace was venting its toxic atmosphere into the factory air, where it could dissipate and be replaced by fresh ventilation from the open doors. By midnight, the danger had receded enough that Brennan felt confident approaching the furnace mouth. He climbed onto the platform with a lamp and leaned cautiously over the opening. The flame burned steadily. The air no longer felt depleted. He descended and stood on the factory floor, 20 feet from the structure, breathing normally. It's clearing, he told Ashford. Give it until morning, make sure. They posted guards for the night with instructions to keep everyone away from the furnace and to report any recurrence of symptoms. Then Brennan returned to his office to write a report for the factory owners, detailing what had happened and what he had learned. The furnace had been safe in every visible way. The fire was out. The metal was cool, but hidden inside, trapped in cavities and chambers where men couldn't see or measure, deadly gases had accumulated during shutdown, waiting for an opportunity to escape. The workers had approached without warning because the danger gave no warning. It was silent, invisible, and lethal. Morning came with grey light filtering through factory windows, illuminating the furnace in its roped enclosure like an exhibit under scrutiny. Brennan returned before dawn, checking the air with a lamp, testing the boundaries that had been deadly the previous day. The flame burned cleanly at every distance. The symptoms had vanished. The gas had dispersed. He authorized the removal of the ropes and allowed the maintenance crew to resume their work, though with new protocols. Men would approach the furnace in pairs. They would carry safety lamps. They would retreat immediately if any symptoms appeared. The work proceeded without incident. The repairs were completed by midday. But the question remained. Why had the gases been retained so long after shutdown? Why hadn't they vented naturally through the stack during the cooling process? Brennan brought the question to a consulting engineer named Edmund Vickers, a man who had designed blast furnaces and understood their internal aerodynamics. Vickers listened to the account and nodded slowly. "Draft collapse," he said. "During operation, the blast drives air upward through the furnace. Hot gases rise naturally, pulled by the temperature difference and pushed by the incoming air. But when you stop the blast, the draft diminishes. If the furnace cools too quickly, the upward flow reverses. Cold air from the stack sinks back down into the furnace, trapping gases below." "So the combustion gases couldn't escape," Brennan said. "Correct. They were pressed downward by the collapsing draft, forced into the lower chambers, held there by pressure and density. As the furnace cooled further, those gases contracted and became even denser, settling at the bottom like water in a well." "How do we prevent it?" Vickers considered. "Maintain draft during shutdown, keep the stack warm. Vent the lower chambers immediately after the blast stops before gases can accumulate, and never assume a cold furnace is a safe furnace." The explanation clarified what had happened, but it also revealed how little had been understood about post-shutdown behavior. The workers had followed every known procedure. The furnace had been shut down correctly, but the procedures were incomplete. They accounted for fire and heat, but not for trapped gases. They assumed that stopping the combustion eliminated the danger, when in fact it only changed its form. Brennan drafted a new set of guidelines. After shutdown, furnaces would be vented for a minimum of 12 hours before any approach was permitted. Lower openings would be opened immediately to allow gas drainage. Safety lamps would be used to test air quality at multiple heights. No one would enter the danger zone until the atmosphere had been verified as safe. The guidelines were distributed to every furnace operation in the region. Some facilities adopted them immediately. Others were skeptical, believing their own procedures were adequate. It would take additional incidents at other sites before the danger became universally recognized. The mechanics of what occurred at the furnace can be stated with precision. During operation, the blast furnace maintained an internal atmosphere dominated by carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and nitrogen gases produced during the reduction of iron ore. These gases were extremely hot, rising naturally through the stack and venting into the open air. The upward flow was sustained by continuous combustion and the forced injection of air through the tires at the furnace base. When the blast was stopped and the fire extinguished, the internal temperature began to drop. As the gases cooled, they contracted and became denser. The natural draft that had pulled them upward diminished and eventually reversed. Cold air from the stack opening sank downward, creating a pressure inversion that trapped the combustion gases in the lower sections of the furnace, the hearth, the Bosch, and the lower stack. Carbon monoxide, which comprises a significant fraction of blast furnace gas, has a molecular weight slightly less than air when hot. But as it cools, its density increases, and in a confined space with diminishing upward flow, it settles to the lowest available volume. The furnace hearth became a reservoir of carbon monoxide-rich gas, held there by the geometry of the structure and the pressure dynamics of cooling. The gas did not remain trapped indefinitely. Small openings at the base of the furnace, tires, tap holes, cinder notches, provided paths for slow leakage. As the internal pressure equalized with the external atmosphere, the gas began to escape. It flowed outward at ground level, where it was denser than the surrounding air. Because carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless, the workers had no sensory warning of its presence. The physiological effects of carbon monoxide poisoning are well documented. The gas binds to hemoglobin in the blood with an affinity far greater than oxygen, displacing oxygen and reducing the blood's capacity to deliver it to tissues. Even low concentrations, below 1% in air, can cause dizziness, confusion, and loss of consciousness within minutes. Higher concentrations can be fatal. The workers who collapsed near the furnace were breathing air that contained enough carbon monoxide to overwhelm their blood oxygen levels rapidly. Those who retreated to fresh air recovered because the body can eliminate carbon monoxide over time, though the process is slow. Those who remained in the contaminated zone would have faced severe poisoning or death. The stratification of the gas, its tendency to pool at a specific height, was a consequence of its density and the lack of air movement in the factory. In still air, gases separate by weight, with heavier gases settling below lighter ones. The carbon monoxide formed a layer that extended outward from the furnace at roughly chest to head height, precisely where men stood and breathed. The delayed release of the gas, hours after shutdown, resulted from the slow equalization of pressures and temperatures inside the furnace. As the metal cooled and contracted, small gaps opened. As the internal gas cooled further, its volume decreased, creating a pressure gradient that drove it outward through available openings. The release was gradual, extending over many hours, which explained why the danger persisted well into the morning after shutdown. The safety lamp provided the first objective evidence of the problem. In air depleted of oxygen by the presence of carbon monoxide, the flame diminished because combustion requires oxygen. The lamp could detect what human senses could not, an atmosphere that appeared normal but was in fact toxic. The incident at the furnace became a reference point in industrial safety, though its lessons were not immediately or universally applied. Some facilities implemented venting protocols, others delayed, citing cost or inconvenience. Men continued to approach dormant furnaces with the assumption that cold meant safe, and in most cases they were correct. But exceptions occurred. Workers collapsed at other sites. Fatalities were recorded. Each incident reinforced the understanding that invisible hazards required new kinds of vigilance. The furnace itself was repaired and returned to operation. It burned for another decade without incident, producing iron in quantities that justified its existence. The men who had collapsed near it recovered fully, though they spoke carefully about the experience, aware that they had survived something that offered no second chances. Thomas Whitley remained in the steelworks for 20 more years. He never forgot the sensation of air that felt like air, but wasn't. He taught younger workers to distrust their assumptions, to test before approaching, to remember that danger does not always announce itself. The procedures that emerged from the incident became part of the standard knowledge of blast furnace operation. Waiting periods after shutdown, forced ventilation of lower chambers, atmospheric testing with safety lamps, the recognition that combustion gases, once produced, do not simply vanish when the fire is extinguished. They persist, trapped in cavities and confined spaces, waiting for paths to escape. A furnace is not inert when cold. It is merely dormant, and dormancy can be as dangerous as flame. In time, the mechanisms became well understood. Engineers learned to calculate gas volumes, predict retention times, design venting systems that prevented accumulation. The science of furnace atmospheres advanced, informed by incidents like this one and by the careful study of gas behavior under varying conditions of temperature, pressure, and geometry. What had been mysterious became routine. What had been deadly became manageable. But the lesson remained essential. Industrial processes create hazards that do not always conform to expectation. Silence is not proof of safety. A structure that appears inert may harbor threats that unfold slowly, invisibly, without warning. The men who approach such structures must carry knowledge as well as tools. They must understand not only what they see, but what they cannot see. They must respect the limits of perception and the persistence of danger in forms that give no indication of their presence. The furnace stood for decades after that October morning, a functional machine serving the purposes for which it was built. But among those who worked near it, and among those who studied what had happened, it stood also as a reminder that death does not always come with heat or flame, that the absence of fire is not the absence of threat. That safety requires understanding what happens in darkness, in stillness, in the hidden spaces where gases accumulate and wait. The furnace that turned deadly after Shutdown taught that lesson. The men who survived it carried it forward.